The morning sun spilled gently across the curtains of their Guaranpa duplex, painting the walls in gold. Nkechi stood before her mirror, adjusting the emerald gown that clung to her graceful frame. Her heart was heavy, but her face bore the mask of a woman determined to smile. Today marked her 35th birthday, and she wanted the world to see her as radiant, cherished, and fulfilled, even if behind that mask lay bruises of neglect. Ola, her husband, had arranged a lavish celebration. The compound was already buzzing with caterers setting up canopies, drummers testing their beats, and ushers laying out rows of golden-trimmed chairs. For a moment, Nkechi almost believed the illusion that her marriage, though scarred by suspicion, still carried the warmth it once promised. But deep down, her instincts whispered that love had long departed their home. Inside the house, the air smelled of vanilla cake, champagne, and perfume. Ola, tall and commanding in his crisp agbada, played the gracious host, moving from one guest to another, laughing a little too loudly, hugging a little too tightly. Nkechi watched him, her heart tightening. Once his laughter had been hers alone, but now it felt rehearsed, a performance for an audience rather than intimacy with a wife. Their friends and relatives, dressed in shimmering fabrics, poured in with gifts and compliments. Everyone commented on how beautiful Nkechi looked, how lucky she was to have a husband who spared nothing to celebrate her. She smiled politely, nodding, while inside she replayed the countless nights he came home late, reeking of perfume she didn't own, his excuses flimsy as tissue. Still, today was hers, and she resolved not to let shadows ruin it. The celebration opened with music and speeches. A live band filled the air with high-life melodies, children danced at the edge of the canopy, and clinking glasses echoed everywhere. Nkechi sat on the raised dais, radiant, waving at well-wishers. Yet her eyes betrayed a flicker of distance, like a woman smiling while her heart bled. Ola gave a speech, lavish words dripping with adoration, calling her his queen, his backbone, his forever. The crowd clapped and cheered, and Nkechi forced herself to bask in the glow, even if it felt hollow. If today was her stage, she would act the role of a happy wife flawlessly. She did not know that behind the curtain of the perfect picture, a storm was preparing to rip everything apart. The night before her birthday, Nkechi had lain awake, her body stiff against the empty side of the bed. Ola had returned long after midnight, smelling faintly of expensive perfume and alcohol. When she asked where he had been, he dismissed her with a tired wave. She remembered staring into the darkness, clutching the sheets as suspicion tightened around her throat. She was not a fool. She had seen the unexplained text messages, the hushed phone calls he would take in the bathroom, the sudden work trips that did not align with his office's calendar. Friends had whispered to her, hinting that Ola had another woman, but none dared to give her a name. To them, it was better to protect her pride than pierce it with truth. On the morning of the party, Nkechi's closest friend, Ijeoma, had pulled her aside. "Nkechi, you're glowing, but I know you," she said softly. "You've been restless these months. Is everything okay with Ola?" Nkechi forced a smile. "Everything is fine. It has to be fine," she replied, her voice shaky. Ijeoma touched her hand, her eyes full of concern. "Be careful, my sister. Sometimes silence is not peace, it's danger waiting to explode." The words clung to Nkechi's mind as she slipped on her heels, as guests filled the compound, as drums thundered with celebration. Beneath every laugh, she felt the tension pressing against her like an invisible wall, threatening to collapse without warning. By the time the party reached its peak, Nkechi had perfected her smile, shaking hands, receiving compliments, and nodding as people called her blessed. Yet even in the midst of music and dancing, she felt eyes watching her, eyes that did not belong to any friend or relative she knew. In the distance, by the gate, she thought she saw a woman standing for a moment before disappearing into the crowd. A ripple of unease coursed through her, but she brushed it off. If her suspicions were true, surely her birthday was not the time to confront them. What she didn't know was that her darkest fear was not only real, but also already plotting an entrance that would strike with the precision of a knife. Across town, Gloria stood before her mirror, fastening diamond earrings and painting her lips with a bold shade of crimson. She admired her reflection, a woman of poise, beauty, and audacity. To the world, she was just another socialite, but in her heart, she believed herself more, the rightful woman in Ola's life, not the timid wife who clung to illusions of marriage. She had waited long enough in the shadows, satisfied with stolen weekends and secret dinners. But today, she was done hiding. Why should Nkechi enjoy the glory while I carry his child? She whispered to herself, her hand resting on her stomach. Whether or not Ola had asked her to stay away, she had made up her mind. She would walk into that birthday party and claim her place, no matter the chaos it sparked. Her friends, seated in the living room, giggled nervously. "Gloria, are you sure?" "This is madness," one of them said, clutching her wine glass. Gloria tilted her chin. "Madness? No. This is justice. She needs to know the truth, that Ola's love belongs to me now." The others exchanged worried glances, but they knew Gloria was stubborn, a woman whose pride was sharper than her beauty. For her, humiliation was never an option. She preferred war to silence. "When I enter that party," she said with a smirk, "the world will know who truly matters to Ola. Nkechi will learn that her crown was borrowed, and I am here to take it back." As she slipped into her scarlet gown, each movement was deliberate, each breath infused with determination. She imagined the look on Nkechi's face when she announced her pregnancy, the whispers that would spread, the shame that would cut deeper than a knife. She had rehearsed it all in her mind, the gasps, the panic, the collapse of that carefully painted picture of a perfect marriage. With heels clicking against the marble floor, Gloria walked out of her apartment like a queen marching to conquer a throne. She believed the night would end with her triumphant. But fate had prepared a script far crueler than she could ever imagine. Back at the celebration, the air pulsed with music and laughter. Guests clinked glasses, children darted between tables, and the birthday cake stood proudly in the center, adorned with golden sparklers. Nkechi sat on her dais, regal and graceful, trying to ignore the pangs in her heart. Ola was at her side, his arm loosely draped across the back of her chair, his laughter louder than ever. The illusion seemed almost perfect, until the compound's iron gates swung wide, and silence rippled across the gathering like a sudden chill. Heads turned as Gloria appeared, her scarlet gown shimmering under the lights, her steps slow and deliberate. She moved with the audacity of someone who belonged, her lips curved in a smirk that mocked every eye upon her. The drummers faltered, the band's music died mid-note, and murmurs spread like wildfire. Some guests gasped, others exchanged shocked glances. Ola froze, his smile collapsing into horror. Nkechi's breath caught in her throat, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had imagined such a moment in nightmares, but never had she thought it would unfold in front of her family, her friends, her entire world. Gloria did not hesitate. She marched forward, hips swaying, her voice slicing through the thick silence. "I couldn't miss wishing my dear Ola's wife a happy birthday," she said, dripping sarcasm. The audacity of her words hit the crowd like a slap. People shifted uneasily, whispering, watching for Nkechi's reaction. Ola stammered, reaching out as if to stop Gloria, but she brushed him aside, relishing his discomfort. All eyes turned to Nkechi, waiting, wondering if she would crumble, scream, or break. Instead, she sat motionless, her back straight, her eyes fixed on the intruder. Beneath her calm, a storm raged, but she would not give Gloria the satisfaction of seeing her flinch, at least not yet. The hall buzzed with whispers as Gloria reached the center of the gathering. She turned dramatically, ensuring every guest had a clear view of her, then raised her chin high. "Since Ola refuses to tell the truth," she announced, her voice steady, "I will. I'm carrying his child." The words detonated like a bomb. Gasps and murmurs erupted from the crowd, some covering their mouths in disbelief, others shaking their heads. Nkechi's vision blurred for a moment, her body stiffening as humiliation struck her like a heavy blow. She saw pity in the eyes of her friends, shock in the eyes of her relatives, and triumph in Gloria's smirk. Ola rushed forward, his voice trembling. "Gloria, stop this nonsense," he hissed, but his protest fell flat. Gloria laughed, tossing her hair back. "Nonsense? You want to call our truth nonsense?" She placed her hand on her stomach, her eyes gleaming with victory. "Everyone deserves to know. Nkechi, you may wear the ring, but I carry the future." Her words cut deep, a dagger designed to pierce the wife's dignity. The guests shifted uneasily, some whispering to each other, others watching Nkechi, waiting for her collapse. But Nkechi did not collapse. Though her chest ached and tears burned at the edge of her eyes, she rose slowly from her seat, her every movement deliberate. She descended the dais with quiet grace, her heels clicking against the tiled floor, her eyes never leaving Gloria's. The room held its breath, the air thick with tension. When she stopped in front of the woman who had come to ruin her, she did not speak at first. Instead, she lifted her hand and, before anyone could predict it, delivered a sharp, resounding slap across Gloria's face. The sound cracked through the hall, silencing every whisper. Gloria staggered back, her smirk gone, replaced with wide-eyed shock. And Nkechi, with her hand still trembling in the air, finally spoke, "You will not disgrace me in my own home." The echo of Nkechi's slap seemed to hang in the air long after her hand had fallen back to her side. Guests who had been murmuring only moments before now sat in stunned silence, their eyes darting between the wife, who had finally stood tall, and the mistress, whose cheeks still burned with the sting of humiliation. Gloria's crimson lips parted, but no sound came, her hand flying instinctively to her face. She had imagined herself victorious tonight, the crowd applauding her audacity and condemning the wife she thought weak. But instead, she found herself stripped of her confidence in one single strike. The boldness she had worn like armor cracked before everyone, and for the first time, she realized that Nkechi was not the timid, breakable woman she had painted in her mind. The silence broke into whispers, then gasps, then outright exclamations, as the crowd digested what had just happened. Women clapped quietly under their breaths, impressed by Nkechi's courage, while men exchanged glances that carried both pity for Ola and admiration for the wife who had defended her dignity. Children froze, wide-eyed, sensing the weight of the moment, though they could not understand its depth. Ola himself stood rigid, sweat breaking across his forehead, his lips parting in horror as he realized the carefully crafted facade of his perfect life had crumbled in seconds. He had wanted to play both worlds, to entertain his mistress in private while parading his wife in public. But now the two worlds had collided violently in front of witnesses who would not soon forget. Gloria, her cheek still red, tried to recover. "How dare you hit me?" she spat, her voice trembling more with fear than fury. But the damage was done. Her arrogance had withered before the audience's eyes, and she now looked less like a conqueror and more like a desperate intruder. Nkechi, on the other hand, did not tremble. She adjusted her gown, raised her chin, and said in a steady tone that sliced through the chaos, "You came here to disgrace me. Instead, you've disgraced yourself." Her words, simple yet loaded, carried the weight of years of pain, humiliation, and silence that had finally broken. The slap was more than physical, it was symbolic, a rejection of years of manipulation, lies, and quiet suffering. As the crowd reeled from the slap, Nkechi reached calmly into her golden clutch, pulling out a white envelope that had sat there like a silent weapon. The murmur of the audience deepened, for they sensed she had not yet finished her reckoning. Slowly, deliberately, she unfolded the papers within, her eyes never leaving Gloria, who had now retreated a step backward, her once bold stance visibly shaken. Ola's breath caught in his throat. He knew what was coming, and he silently cursed himself for underestimating the quiet strength of the woman he thought he could discard. Nkechi held the paper up, her voice firm and unwavering. "Since we are trading truths tonight, let me reveal one Ola hoped would never come to light." The guests leaned forward, hungry for the unfolding drama. Nkechi's words rang out clear as a bell. "This is a medical report. It confirms that my husband, Ola, was diagnosed months ago with infertility. He cannot father a child." Gasps erupted across the hall, loud and unrestrained. Whispers turned to outright exclamations, hands covered mouths, and heads turned sharply toward Ola, whose once confident figure now looked small, cornered, and utterly exposed. Gloria's eyes widened in disbelief, her hand dropping from her cheek as the room spun around her. The truth she had intended to wield as a dagger against Nkechi had been turned into a sword that pierced her instead. Ola stumbled forward, his voice cracking. "Nkechi, stop this. Don't do this in front of everyone." But it was too late. The document was already visible to those seated closest, its contents undeniable. Nkechi's calmness was more terrifying than any outburst. It was the quiet vengeance of a woman who had been underestimated for too long. Her gaze fixed on Gloria, she delivered the final blow. "So tell us, Gloria, whose child are you really carrying? Because it is not his." The words fell heavy, final, and absolute. Gloria's lips quivered, her eyes darting desperately around the hall, but no rescue came. The silence that followed was louder than the slap itself. It was the silence of reputations collapsing, of lies unraveling, of pride being shattered beyond repair. Gloria's legs trembled as whispers filled the room like rising smoke, suffocating and inescapable. The same faces that had once admired her beauty now looked at her with ridicule and scorn. Guests laughed bitterly under their breaths, their pity reserved solely for Nkechi, not the intruder who had barged into another woman's home. Her crimson gown, once her armor, now felt like a shroud that magnified her shame. She tried to summon words, to spin a defense, but none came. Her carefully crafted lie had unraveled in seconds, and now she stood exposed, powerless, and humiliated before an audience that would carry this story beyond the walls of the party. Women shook their heads, whispering lessons to their daughters about the folly of arrogance. Men murmured amongst themselves, disgusted at her audacity, some openly mocking her. She thought she had the upper hand. One said, "But look at her now." Gloria's pride, once her greatest strength, collapsed under the weight of public disgrace. She turned to Ola for rescue, her eyes pleading, but his face was buried in his palms, his body bent like a man carrying a crushing weight. For the first time, Gloria realized that the man she had sacrificed her reputation for could not save her. In fact, he would not even try. Nkechi, meanwhile, stood poised, her breathing steady, her dignity intact. She had transformed in the eyes of the crowd from a fragile wife into a formidable woman whose silence had concealed sharp wisdom. She did not gloat, did not shout, did not revel in Gloria's collapse. She simply stood in stillness, her eyes cold but her back straight, letting the truth do all the work. And that, more than the slap, more than the document, was what destroyed Gloria, the realization that she had lost not to rage or theatrics, but to a woman's calm, deliberate resolve. The murmurs turned toward Ola, and soon the hall's atmosphere thickened with scorn directed at him. Family members glared in disappointment, friends muttered about betrayal, and business associates whispered about his shame. The man who had built his reputation on power and control now looked small, cornered in the very home he had tried to rule. His Igbada, once a symbol of authority, now hung on him like a burden. Every eye judged him not only for his infidelity, but for his weakness, for allowing his mistress to humiliate his wife, and for being careless enough to let his medical truth become public knowledge. He tried to speak, his voice trembling. "My people, please, this is not the place," but his words were cut short by laughter, bitter and mocking. "Not the place," someone shouted from the back. "Yet it was the place to parade your shamelessness." Another voice added, "You let your wife suffer. And for what? A lie." Ola's chest heaved as anger and shame clashed within him. He wanted to rage, to shout, to silence them all, but he knew the truth could not be undone. His arrogance had trapped him, and now there was no escape. As he looked at Nkechi, standing tall in her golden gown, he saw a woman he no longer recognized. She had been patient, quiet, forgiving. Yet in one night she had turned the tables, making him the object of ridicule, making Gloria the fool. For the first time in years, fear pricked Ola's heart. He realized that the power he thought he wielded over his wife had always been borrowed. She had chosen silence not out of weakness, but out of restraint. Now that she had unleashed the truth, there was no going back. And as the crowd watched him, Ola understood he was no longer the man of the house, the man of respect, or the man of influence. He was nothing more than a disgraced husband. The night had spiraled into a theater of betrayal, truth, and disgrace, and Nkechi knew she had delivered her part. With one last look at Gloria, who stood trembling, and at Ola, who hung his head in defeat, she lifted her chin and turned toward the door. The hall fell silent again, for everyone sensed this was the final act. Her gown trailed behind her, shimmering under the lights like the cloak of a queen reclaiming her throne. She walked slowly but steadily, each step echoing with dignity. The guests parted in silence, giving her a clear path, their eyes filled with admiration. Some whispered blessings, others nodded respectfully. She did not look back. She had no need to. Ola stumbled forward, his voice cracking. "Nkechi, wait. Please let me explain," but his words hung in the air unanswered. For once, he had no power over her. Gloria tried to move, as if to block her path, but the sharp glares of the guests pinned her in place. She dared not provoke another slap, another humiliation. Nkechi walked past the open gates, the cool night air washing over her, as though cleansing her spirit. It was not victory she felt, not entirely, but liberation. She had endured enough years of lies and insults. Tonight, she had chosen herself. Behind her, the party crumbled into chaos. Guests departed in clusters, muttering about what they had witnessed, their voices carrying the scandal far beyond the compound. Ola stood broken, his hands trembling, his eyes wet. Gloria slumped into a chair, her bravado extinguished, her mind racing with panic about what would come next. But outside, Nkechi lifted her eyes to the moonlit sky and took a deep breath. For the first time in years, she felt light, not because the pain was gone, but because she had finally refused to carry it any longer. This birthday had begun as a celebration meant to humiliate her, but it ended as the night she walked out with her power intact. The days following the disastrous birthday party stretched long and heavy. The once bustling home became a cavernous silence, broken only by the clinking of cutlery or the shuffle of feet against marble floors. Ola attempted to approach Nkechi several times, knocking gently on the guest room door where she had moved her belongings. "Nkechi, please," he whispered, his voice low with shame. "Let me explain." But every time he was met with the same response: silence. She neither shouted nor argued, nor even acknowledged him. That silence was heavier than any slap, sharper than any insult, and it echoed in his chest until it burned. He found himself wandering the house like a stranger, looking at the woman he had once thought pliant and weak, and realizing she now wielded a weapon stronger than anger: indifference. At meals, she sat at the far end of the dining table, her eyes fixed on her food while he fumbled through apologies, trying to fill the void. She answered him only with nods or curt one-word replies when absolutely necessary. What unnerved him most was her calmness. He had expected rage, tears, perhaps even begging for answers, but instead she chose restraint. Her silence was not the quiet of weakness. It was the silence of someone who no longer sought his validation. It forced him to confront his own failures without the relief of distraction. The wife he had thought powerless was now holding him accountable without lifting a finger. The walls of the home seemed to press in on Ola, each corner echoing his humiliation. He began to fear the silence, for in it he saw the reflection of his ruin, his wife's dignity against his own disgrace. The absence of confrontation gave him no chance to twist the narrative, no opportunity to shift the blame. Instead, her silence pinned him beneath the weight of truth, leaving him restless at night, pacing the corridors like a man haunted. For the first time in his life, he realized that the woman he had underestimated had mastered the art of punishment without words. Across town, Gloria's world collapsed with alarming speed. The whispers that had begun at the party spread into every circle she frequented. Former friends crossed the street to avoid her, their laughter dripping with mockery as soon as her back was turned. At salons, the women who once envied her style now muttered "homewrecker" under their breath. The men who once praised her beauty now avoided her entirely, wary of associating with scandal. Even her family, embarrassed by the disgrace, refused to entertain her explanations. She was alone, clutching her stomach in a mix of fear and shame, desperately trying to convince herself she could still salvage her pride. Gloria dialed Ola's number incessantly, her fingers trembling as she pressed call after call. "Ola, please, you can't leave me like this. The child is yours." "You know it is," she pleaded in voicemails, her voice cracking. But Ola ignored her. Each ignored call deepened her panic. Each unanswered message made her desperation louder. She tried showing up at his office, dressed in her best, only to be turned away by security guards who had been instructed to keep her out. The sting of rejection was worse than the slap she had received at the party. The man she had once flaunted as her conquest now treated her as a ghost, erasing her existence to save what little dignity he had left. At night, Gloria stared at the ceiling of her small apartment, her pride shredded. She remembered her bold promise before walking into that party, how she would dethrone Nkechi and claim her crown. Now she was the one dethroned, mocked, and cast aside. Her beauty, once her weapon, now felt like a curse. Her phone buzzed with gossip, her name dragged across social media, her scandal replayed in memes and stories. She realized bitterly that she had been nothing more than a tool in Ola's hands, a temporary thrill discarded when it threatened his empire. And now, without him, she was left with nothing but shame and a child whose future she could no longer promise. Ola's family became a battlefield of whispers, arguments, and condemnation. His mother, who had adored Nkechi as the quiet, dutiful wife, wept openly when she learned of the humiliation Nkechi had endured. "Ola, you brought shame to our name," she said, her voice trembling with grief. His sisters, sharp-tongued and merciless, scolded him without restraint. "How could you let that woman humiliate Nkechi? How could you disrespect your wife in front of the world?" His uncles, worried about their own reputations, warned him that his recklessness would stain the family name for generations. For the first time, Ola found himself surrounded not by admiration, but by condemnation. The division grew deeper as some family members, out of loyalty to blood, tried to excuse his actions. "A man will always be a man," one uncle muttered, shrugging. But those words ignited outrage in the women of the family, who reminded him that Nkechi had stood with dignity, while Ola had brought disgrace. Family meetings devolved into heated debates, with voices rising, accusations flying, and tears spilling. The fracture widened until Ola realized that even within his own bloodline, he no longer commanded respect. His family was united not around him, but around his wife, the very woman he had taken for granted. Nkechi, on the other hand, did not involve herself in their quarrels. She remained silent, dignified, allowing his family to draw their own conclusions. And they did. Slowly, more and more of them rallied to her side, praising her courage, admiring her composure. Ola felt himself shrinking in those gatherings. His once commanding presence ignored as relatives turned their attention to Nkechi with empathy and admiration. It was a bitter irony. The wife he had tried to diminish now stood taller than him even in the eyes of his kin. While Ola wrestled with shame and Gloria wallowed in isolation, Nkechi began to rediscover herself. She poured her energy into her career, working longer hours, taking on projects that once intimidated her. Colleagues noticed the change. The once quiet woman now spoke with authority, led with confidence, and carried herself with a new aura of independence. Her transformation became the subject of admiration among her peers. "She's stronger than she's ever been," they whispered, marveling at her ability to thrive even as scandal swirled around her name. Nkechi's resilience became her crown, her dignity her weapon. She also immersed herself in community work, finding fulfillment in helping young women navigate the challenges of marriage and independence. She became a symbol of strength, her story whispered as a lesson that silence is not always weakness, and dignity can destroy arrogance more than rage ever could. Invitations began to pour in for her to speak at gatherings, to share her journey. She accepted only a few, never seeking the spotlight, but wherever she appeared, she left an impression. People saw not a broken wife, but a woman who had turned pain into purpose. At home, her presence unsettled Ola even more. He had expected her to wither after the scandal, to cling to him for support, to beg for reconciliation. Instead, she flourished. Each morning, as she dressed sharply for work and left the house without a word, he felt smaller. She no longer asked about his day, no longer waited for him to return home, no longer sought his approval. She had cut the invisible cord that once tied her self-worth to his presence. And that, more than the public humiliation, crushed him. He was losing her not because of anger, but because she no longer needed him. The cracks in Ola's personal life bled quickly into his business empire. Rumors of his disgrace at the party reached boardrooms and offices, where whispers spread faster than contracts could be signed. Business partners grew wary of him, questioning his judgment and reliability. Some quietly withdrew from deals, citing unforeseen circumstances. Others openly expressed concern that associating with him would tarnish their reputations. What had once been his greatest pride, his business acumen, began to crumble under the weight of gossip and distrust. At the office, even his employees whispered behind his back. Secretaries who once respected him now avoided eye contact, while junior staff passed around jokes at his expense. His authority weakened. His presence no longer commanded obedience, but mockery. Ola tried to assert control, but his voice cracked with desperation rather than confidence. Each failed deal, each withdrawn contract, ate at him, leaving him restless and angry. He realized that scandal, once thought a private matter, had now seeped into every corner of his world. The slap and the secret had destroyed not just his marriage, but his legacy. At home, he sat in his study late into the night, staring at documents he could no longer save, his head in his hands. The phone that once rang with opportunities now buzzed only with creditors and disappointed partners. He looked at Nkechi as she walked past his study without a glance, her heels clicking like a reminder of his irrelevance. The empire he had built on arrogance and deceit was collapsing, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He had thought himself untouchable, but now he saw the truth. A man's empire can crumble not from outside forces, but from the silent strength of the woman he thought powerless. Gloria's world shriveled into something unrecognizable. The once coveted mistress, who strutted in designer heels, now found herself walking through streets with lowered eyes, her presence no longer commanding envy, but disgust. The rumors had hardened into a truth no one doubted. She was carrying a child whose father was unknown, and she had gambled her dignity on a man who publicly disowned her. Even the father she had once depended on for counsel refused her calls, ashamed of the spectacle she had become. The friends who used to sit in her living room sipping champagne and encouraging her boldness now deleted her number. Their loyalty evaporated the moment her power crumbled. Gloria realized that the applause she mistook for support was only people entertained by her recklessness. When the drama ended, they abandoned her, leaving her to drown alone in the whispers. The man who was truly responsible for her pregnancy, a businessman she had briefly entangled herself with before Ola, now refused to even acknowledge her. When she confronted him, demanding he take responsibility, he coldly said, "Don't bring your mess to my doorstep. You chose to play games, and you lost." His rejection cut deeper than any insult at the birthday party, for it confirmed her worst fear. She had no one left to fight for her. The glamorous woman, who once declared herself destined to replace Nkechi, was now reduced to pleading, begging, and groveling. Her red gowns and stilettos gathered dust in her wardrobe while she hid indoors, her confidence rotting under the weight of shame. Nights were the hardest. Alone in her apartment, Gloria would lie on her bed with swollen eyes, replaying the slap over and over, hearing the laughter of guests echo in her mind. She remembered the look on Ola's face, the way he refused to defend her, the way he left her stranded in humiliation. It haunted her, twisting her pride into ashes. She once believed she could write her own destiny by force, but now she saw the truth. Her entire rise had been built on lies, and when those lies collapsed, nothing remained. She was abandoned not just by men, but by society itself, left to carry the burden of her choices with no ally, no sympathy, no redemption. As Gloria faded into obscurity, Ola found himself turning back to the only person who had ever truly stood by him, Nkechi. He had once taken her silence for weakness, her patience for naivety, but now he recognized them as strength, as dignity he could never replicate. Every evening he knocked softly on her door, his voice broken. "Nkechi, please. I know I failed you. I know I've shamed you. But don't throw me away. We can fix this." His words dripped with desperation, but each time, silence answered him. Her indifference was a wall taller than his pride, and no matter how he begged, it never cracked. Ola tried different strategies. Some nights he wept openly, hoping her compassion would resurface and draw her back to him. Other nights he grew angry, banging his fists on the door, shouting that she had no right to treat him like a stranger. But even in his anger, he realized the truth. He had lost all authority. The same woman he had dismissed, controlled, and silenced now commanded the entire direction of his life without uttering a single word. And that terrified him. He began to feel like a ghost in his own home, wandering aimlessly while Nkechi walked with quiet grace, her heels clicking on marble like a metronome counting down to his end. He even sought help from his family, begging his mother and sisters to intercede on his behalf. "Talk to Nkechi," he pleaded, his voice hoarse. "Tell her to forgive me." But his mother only shook her head, tears glistening in her eyes. "You destroyed the trust she gave you, Ola. You made a mockery of her dignity. Forgiveness is not something you demand. It is something you must deserve. And right now you don't." His sisters were even harsher, refusing to mediate. They told him plainly that Nkechi's silence was her choice, and if he truly wanted her back, he would have to earn her respect again, a task that seemed impossible for a man who had once thought himself untouchable. For the first time in his life, Ola realized what it meant to beg without hope. The humiliation that began in the privacy of his home soon bled into the wider world. Ola's business empire, once his crown, began to rot from within. Board members whispered of his instability, investors pulled out of projects, and competitors capitalized on his weakness. Meetings that once ended with applause now dissolved into silence, his suggestions dismissed as reckless. Contracts slipped from his fingers, his reputation dragged down by the weight of scandal. Newspapers and blogs feasted on his downfall, replaying the birthday humiliation in lurid detail, turning his private shame into public entertainment. He was no longer introduced as a successful businessman, but as the man whose mistress was slapped and exposed. The ridicule did not stop at the office. At social gatherings, whispers trailed him like shadows. Once respected friends excused themselves from his company, unwilling to be tainted by association. Younger men who once admired him now mocked him, their laughter carrying sharp jabs at his expense. "There goes Ola," one quipped in a club, "the man who lost everything to his own arrogance." The ridicule cut deeper than any financial loss, for it stripped him of the respect he had built his identity on. He realized that money could be rebuilt, but reputation, once shattered, was nearly impossible to recover. Even in church, where he once sat proudly at the front pew, heads turned, whispers buzzing. Pastors prayed for men who forget their vows, without naming him, but everyone knew. He felt smaller each Sunday, sinking into the bench, unable to meet the eyes of those around him. His life, once a crown of influence and pride, had become a cloak of shame he could not shed. Everywhere he turned, he saw the evidence of his ruin, and in the center of it all stood the memory of a woman who had destroyed him not with anger, but with truth. While Ola crumbled and Gloria vanished into obscurity, Nkechi's silence continued to work like fire. She did not scream her victory, nor did she parade his downfall. She simply lived with dignity, refusing to engage with his begging or his excuses. That quietness, more than anything, was her revenge. It denied him the chance to control the narrative, denied him the relief of confrontation, denied him the opportunity to manipulate her emotions. In silence, she watched him unravel, and in silence, she built herself anew. Her community began to look at her with fresh eyes. She became a model of resilience, whispered about with admiration in homes and offices alike. "Did you see how Nkechi handled her shame?" women said, nodding with respect. She did not scream, she did not fight, but she left them both destroyed. Even men spoke of her as a force, acknowledging that she had turned the tables in ways no fury could. Her calmness became legendary, a quiet warning to those who thought wives powerless. Without lifting her voice, she had turned betrayal into poetic justice. In private moments, Nkechi reflected not on vengeance, but on freedom. She had spent years bound to Ola's moods, his betrayals, his arrogance. Now she was unshackled. Each morning she rose, dressed sharply, and carried herself as a woman untethered from the lies of her marriage. She realized that her revenge was not in his ruin alone, but in her refusal to let his ruin consume her. She had not only reclaimed her dignity, she had redefined herself. That, she knew, was the sweetest form of victory. The final chapter of their story unfolded quietly, not with the fanfare of parties or the drama of public confrontations, but with the simple image of a woman walking forward alone. Nkechi stood on her balcony one evening, the city lights glittering below, a gentle breeze tugging at her hair. She thought of the girl she had been at her wedding, hopeful, trusting, naive. She thought of the woman who had stood on her birthday dais, trembling as her husband's mistress announced a pregnancy. And then she thought of the woman she was now, strong, unbroken, dignified, and free. She smiled, not out of arrogance, but out of peace. Ola sat alone in the same house, his empire gone, his mistress abandoned, his reputation shredded. He often watched Nkechi from a distance, hoping for a chance to rebuild what he had destroyed. But she no longer looked at him with longing or dependence. Her eyes carried a distance that made it clear she had moved on. He was a shadow of her past, a cautionary tale rather than a partner. And he knew, deep in his bones, that no matter how much he begged, the woman he had once underestimated would never return to him. Gloria, forgotten and disgraced, wandered through the margins of society, a cautionary tale of arrogance without wisdom. No one remembered her beauty, only her downfall. But Nkechi, she remained, not as a victim, but as a survivor who had turned her humiliation into a crown of strength. Her story became legend in whispers, a testimony that betrayal does not have the last word when dignity stands its ground. She had risen from ashes, leaving behind the ruins of a husband's arrogance and a mistress's pride. And as she stepped back into her living room, her head high, she knew her life had only just begun. Please like, share, and subscribe. Your support means the world to us. Thank you for watching to the end. Don't forget to come back for the next amazing tale yet.